Alrighty, well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. And we are joined on this spontaneous edition, on this breaking news edition. We are joined by Oscar Grenfell of the Socialist Equality Party of Australia and a frequent contributor to the World Socialist website. And this breaking news edition, I'll be speaking with Mr. Grenfell mainly on the tragic ruling of the Julian Assange case. And we're also going to be talking about some other topics. We're going to be talking all things Australia, as well as the ongoing coronavirus crisis and the pandemic. So first of all, Oscar, thank you so much for joining me today. And of course, very last minute. So thank you very much for joining me on your Sunday.
No, thanks very much for having me on. And I know it's very early in the morning where you are, so it's good you're able to arrange this. Great.
Well, thank you. It's an honor to have you on, especially because I love the World Socialist website. I've had Nick Beams, a member of your party, on the Australian branch here before. One of the very first programs had Chris Marsden of the SCP in Britain, and I've had Thomas Peters and John Braddock of the SCG Socialist Equality Group of New Zealand on. So it's a real honor to have you on, especially when it comes to the Julian Assange case, which I have to commend the World Socialist website. I believe your publication has been one of the few left-wing groups that has actually stuck by Julian Assange to the very bitter end, when so many of what you guys describe as the pseudo-left have thrown this poor man under the bus time and time again. And there was a period where it was very popular to kick the guy while he was down and then smear Julian Assange before defending him. But you never, the World Socialist website never did that. John Pilger never did that. So I have to commend. So I have to commend you guys for that.
Thanks.
And so Julian Assange, can you explain what happened with his with his appeal case at the I think the Supreme Courts of the United Kingdom, right?
Yeah, that's right. So the Supreme Court, the highest court in Britain where the extradition case is being heard, declared early last week that it wasn't allowing Assange's appeal to be heard against a high court ruling mandating his extradition to the United States. So I think it's very significant. It's not as though there was an appeals hearing. The Supreme Court issued a one-line ruling unexpectedly. They declared that Mr. Assange does not have an arguable point of law, so we're not hearing the appeal. According to British legal commentators, this is irregular. I mean, the High Court had found that Assange did have a point of law to appeal. It was expected that there would be some sort of appeals hearing, but that's been scotched. And I think that's just the latest in a string of judicial irregularities, really travesties, trampling on every one of Assange's democratic and legal rights. And this does escalate the moves to dispatch him to the United States, where, as I'm sure your viewers know, he faces 175 years in prison under Espionage Act charges. And essentially what he's accused of is exposing American war crimes, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan, as a journalist and publisher. So each one of these attacks on his rights establishes a very significant precedent for broader frame-ups, persecutions, not just of national security journalists, but I think of anti-war activists under conditions where there's a lot of hostility to war, particularly within the working class.
So the Supreme Court of of the UK won't even hear won't even hear the case of the appeal. Does this mean that there is no more hope for Julian Assange, and that it's time for us to prepare for the worst? That he is going to be extradited in in the U.S. He's not going to get a fair trial, and we're going to see him incarcerated for, I would assume, a bulk of the Biden administration, and whichever rival oligarch was to replace him, whether it's a Republican or another Democrats.
Yeah, well, I think it certainly heightens that danger as an imminent prospect. So what happens now is that the case returns to the district court, the lowest court. That's a formality, and then it will be passed on to Priti Patel, the British Home Secretary, for review. I mean, we know that Johnson government, along with the Labor Party, are completely committed to this frame-up of Assange, so that is also something of a formality. These appeal hearings centered on the issue of Assange's health. So the very first hearings at the district court had heard the issues of exposures of war crimes, the assault on free speech, but they'd also heard evidence about the gross, impact on Assange's physical and mental health of his decade-long persecution.
Yeah.
And that first court, the district court, accepted that he would likely die a very premature death if he were extradited to the United States, both because of his conditions and because of, the appalling character of his treatment, the treatment that he would receive in an American supermax jail. So extradition was initially blocked on that ground. Then the US appealed that ruling at the High Court, and they did so on the basis of diplomatic assurances. So essentially the US government said that Assange's treatment wouldn't be as bad as his lawyers are alleging. He could potentially serve out his sentence in Australia. These assurances, I mean, they weren't worth the paper they were written on. They contained, clauses saying that the CIA could essentially hold Assange under whatever conditions they wished once he was within the United States, including special administrative measures, which is basically a regime of total isolation that's imposed on terrorists, people convicted of national security offences. Despite the worthless character of those assurances, the High Court essentially accepted them, overturning the previous bar on extradition from the district court. So, it's a long and convoluted process through the British court system, but essentially any avenue of appeal on the issue of Assange's health is now finished, as far as the British courts are concerned. He can appeal the substantive political issues. So the fact that extradition under the US-UK treaty is banned for political offences, the fact that this is a frontal assault on freedom of speech, the fact that it's politically motivated, as evidenced by, as we've said, the fact that the government that's seeking Assange's extradition plotted to kidnap and assassinate him, really extraordinary. So he can appeal on those points, one would believe, although you never really know what the British courts will do. I mean, there's one irregularity after the other. But I think, again, the alternatives essentially are they'll try to extradite him very rapidly and circumvent those appeals I mentioned, or he'll continue to be detained in Belmarsh prison, this maximum security facility where his health is deteriorating. He's prevented from being with his friends, his family, and the like. So I think, for us, what this Supreme Court decision really demonstrates is that, of course, his lawyers are fighting the case as well as they can within the court system, but this is a judiciary that is part of the sort of mechanism, one part of the mechanism of his persecution. And really any conception that this is going to be resolved in Assange's favour solely through the courts or through appeals to the governments that are persecuting him, I think has been refuted. And so really, the critical issue is the development of an independent political movement of the working class in defense of his rights, but also fighting for his unconditional freedom. So that's very much what we're putting forward.
And so there still is a chance that he can. So there still is a chance, we hope, that he can appeal on the grounds of you can't send me over to the U.S. because they're clearly after me because of my politics and because of the publications that that WikiLeaks has released. So he can still appeal on that, but knowing the grotesque ruling Tory government and their partners in crime, the Labour Party, so they're going to try to expedite they're going to try to quicken that process, right?
Yeah, I mean that's what this sort of summary Supreme Court dismissal of the appeal indicates. They're trying to speed this up. They've decided now's the time, particularly under conditions where there is a war unfolding in Europe. I think the determination to suppress Assange, WikiLeaks, make an example of them to intimidate broader anti-war opposition is very much at the fore. And in terms of, appealing on the substantive political grounds, I mean, those arguments were heard in the district court, the very first court to have heard this case, and the judge, Vanessa Barretzer, sided with the United States on everything. Essentially,
Exactly.
Governments have the right. Yeah, governments have the right to prosecute journalists who expose their crimes. A very dangerous precedent. So that argument has been heard, and the British courts have indicated their standpoint. So even if that appeal is heard, I think, the outcome of it is fairly predictable. And then, of course, there's the possibility of further appeals to the European Court of Human Rights. That would be the final appeal process. But, again, whether, the British state and its accomplices would even accept a verdict. Yeah, I mean, I think, there is just an extraordinary degree of lawlessness about this entire vendetta that's been waged over the course of a decade. And it is a very sharp expression of a much broader assault on democratic rights, which is directed against Assange as an individual, but also really against the working class. There is mounting social and political opposition to the growth of inequality, the homicidal COVID policies that have been implemented, and I think above all the issue of war. And governments are establishing a precedent, seeking to intimidate that opposition. They're very determined to press ahead, which indicates, again, that this can only be defeated by mobilising a force that's more powerful than all of these governments, the CIA, etc., and that is the working class.
And we can't talk about Julian Assange without talking about, as I mentioned from the get-go, the fact that Julian has been thrown under the bus by so many institutions, so many left-leaning groups, which should be, at the front line of defending him. So I want you don't hold back. Name all of the names, of all of those what the World Socialist website calls the pseudo left groups that have thrown Julian Assange under the bus. And then even when they are defending him, they do this thing where they smear him or they criticize him and then they defend him. When it's like, well, if you're not going to say anything like, to help the guy, just at best stay silent then. But talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, if we were going to name all of the names, we'd be here for a very long time. I think, as you said before, I mean, it's really a whole milieu of groups that call themselves left-wing, trade unions, which have completely abandoned Assange. But worse than that, in many cases, they've supported his persecution. I think a key turning point was the levelling of sexual misconduct allegations in Sweden. I mean, this was a transparent frame-up that's been documented in a great deal of detail by the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Nils Melzer, and many others. Assange was never charged with a crime. This was a means of both ensnaring him in the judicial system and blackening his name. But a whole group of pseudo-left organisations lined up behind this. They lent credence to it because they're based on identity politics, you know, the promotion of race, gender, sexuality above the issues of class, and their positions on identity politics, excuse me, advance the interests of an affluent, privileged layer of the upper middle class, ensconced in academia, the top echelons of the public sector, and the trade union bureaucracy. So we know, you know, he's been smeared for years and years as a sexual criminal, whatever else, without a shred of evidence on the basis of this, you know, these bogus, discredited allegations, which in the end were completely dropped by Swedish prosecutors once they'd served their purpose, again, without him ever being charged. I think the other aspect of this is the increasing alignment of many of these pseudo-left groups with imperialist war. For instance, you know, certainly the pseudo-left parties in Australia, so Socialist Alternative is the largest one. They supported the regime change operations in Syria and Libya that were waged by the United States, the CIA. They presented these operations as, you know, a revolution, completely ignoring the fact that
didn't they even say that like that some of these non-existent moderate rebels in Syria and Libya, that they had like a Trotskyist character, which I know probably you guys take a special offense to because you guys are the oldest Trotskyist organization, right?
Yeah, well, we're really the only Trotskyist organization, and no, I mean, they could never explain who these moderate rebels were, which groups in Syria or Libya were, you know, elaborating a progressive perspective for the working class. You know, this was a revolution, you know, the result of massive CIA gun running funding and carried out by Islamists, including Al Qaeda, ISIS, etc. In the case of Libya, you know, a massive NATO bombardment, which destroyed one of the most advanced countries in North Africa. 10 years on, you now have slave markets, you know, black Africans being sold, multiple vying governments, rebel groups trying to control oil, you know, a quote unquote failed state. It's also the case that many of these groups supported the coup in Ukraine in 2014, where the United States and NATO intervened to remove a government, a Ukrainian government that was aligning towards Russia. In that instance, they mobilized fascistic forces, groups that hailed the Ukrainian Nazi collaborators of World War II to install a right-wing, essentially NATO-aligned government in Ukraine. And I think, you know, that brings us to the present situation. We've said with the current war.
Exactly.
You can't understand it. Yeah, you can't understand it by looking at who fired the first shot. It needs to be placed in its broader historical context, which is the relentless expansion of NATO eastwards since 1991, open discussions within US foreign policy circles that they need to dominate Eurasian landmass, and that the means of doing that is confrontation with both Russia and China. Ultimately aimed at...
actually they would of course not many people know this because it's heavily suppressed amongst even the pseudo-left groups that you were talking about, is that the US and its allies actually would like to see the Russian Federation broken up even further, that they actually don't even want Russia to even exist as a country. So you know, the attempt at the color revolution in Belarus, in which they had their pseudo-left partners trying to, overthrow the sort of, I think your publication would describe, Alexander Lukashenko as, Stalinist. And of course, Putin, Putin may not be. I mean, he's no friend to the working class. Certainly no friend to feminists, queer liberation, or or the broader working class. But the fact of the matter is, is that they want to provoke a war with Russia because rival capitalists, the West has to be the one to dominate, and so forth, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, our position on Putin is very clear. I mean, we've unequivocally denounced the invasion. He represents the interests of a Russian capitalist oligarchy, which emerged through the Stalinist dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. That crime, the last crime of the Stalinist bureaucracy, has really set the stage for the current conflict. It emboldened the US to expand its militarism greatly, the supposed unipolar moment. It broke the Soviet Union up into a host of republics, each ruled by an oligarchy, buttressing its rule with the promotion of nationalism. And, Putin's only response to NATO encirclement, the provocations of the US, is military brinkmanship on one hand, as we're seeing with the invasion of Ukraine, and also hopes for some sort of deal with the imperialist powers. Certainly, I think his calculation with Ukraine was that, he could pressure Biden to pull back or to come to some arrangement, which is a disastrous miscalculation. It just exposes the bankruptcy of any perspective based on Russian nationalism, whatever else. But that being said, I mean, the United States and NATO are the primary aggressors here. They've stoked this up over decades. And Biden signed an agreement with the Zelensky government late last year, I believe it was September, denouncing Russia, pledging to press ahead with Ukraine's integration into NATO. It was, it had the character of sort of unstated declaration of war. And after that, Putin repeatedly said, our red line is Ukraine being brought into NATO. We want a security guarantee. Biden rejected that. So essentially, Biden has gotten the war that he wanted, the US ruling elite wanted. And I think you can see the rapidity with which they've flooded Ukraine with advanced armaments. I mean, this is not something that's organized overnight. This has long been in the offing. Biden recently boasted, US military aid to Ukraine was greater last year than any other time over the past 30 odd years. So I think the way that ties into the issue of Assange is, you do have this wartime atmosphere being whipped up in all of the imperialist centres, certainly here, Britain, the United States, racist and really chauvinistic attacks on everything Russian, including artists, musicians who have no responsibility whatsoever for what's taking place, and a sort of hysteria, particularly being manufactured by the media.
This goes beyond, what some people have called the new McCarthyism or neo-McCarthyism. This goes beyond all that. This is just naked Russophobia. Sanctions are an act of war. I mean, the sanctions on Russia is basically a collective punishment against the Russian working class. Russia already has gross income. Already has gross income inequality, in which, apart from Moscow or St. Petersburg, there's not much of an economy going for the working class, the chronically unemployed. But even then, the fact that what was the owner of the Chelsea football team is not allowed to be the owner anymore simply because of his nationality, and people, and Universal Music is pulling its Russian operations out, and then from McDonald's to Burger King to banks, and then of course we have to talk about the extreme censorship that was met at RT, Sputnik, and Mafic, a Russian affiliated media outlet, and where's the je suis Charlie for all of these people? Where's the je suis Julian? Where's the je suis Julian Assange and people saying that, like, we stand with WikiLeaks. So I just have to say that first of all, yes, I stand in solidarity with RT, Sputnik, Mafic, and Julian Assange, and yeah, just we all of just we all of them, right?
Yeah, well, and I think, I mean, one thing about the propaganda barrage is it's all based on presenting the events in Ukraine in complete isolation. I mean, if you follow the media, it's like the past 30 years didn't happen. The Gulf War, the NATO dismemberment of Yugoslavia, Iraq, Afghanistan, the list goes on, and just none of it is mentioned. Innumerable pro-war pundits have suddenly discovered the horrors of war crimes, but only when they're committed allegedly by Russia. No problem with their own government's actions, or Saudi Arabia executing 81 people the other week.
And I mean, I don't mind people who want to do a telethon and say that they stand with the victims of war, but the fact of the matter is where were all of these pseudo left leaning Hollywood folk when Iraq, Libya, the ongoing attempts to balkanize Syria? I mean, where are all of those people, with flags that say, we stand with, we stand with, Iraq, we stand with Libya, we stand with Haiti. I mean, it's just that's what I find just, the most. Stomach churning. But I think a lot of that has to. But I think a lot of that also has to do with the fact that under Democratic administrations, normalizing the unthinkable just happens. Normalizing the unthinkable just happens, and people who once upon a time would have been opposed to drones if it was George W. Bush, when it's Obama, Clinton, and Biden, everything's all hunky dory. So they'll say no war for oil when it's Iraq being invaded by the Bush administration, but when it's Libya, or we want to sneak into a little pipeline in Syria, evil get. Yeah, exactly, right.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point about that is that, I mean, this is not an anti-war movement. Those declaring it's necessary to stand with Ukraine. It's a pro-war movement, and their key slogans are establish a no-fly zone over Ukraine, which would mean direct military conflict between the United States and Russia. That is, potentially a world war. Calls for the assassination of Putin, in violation of international law and the like. I mean, we say very clearly we don't stand with Ukraine. What does that mean? It means backing a proxy of the US and NATO in a war which threatens catastrophe. I mean, we stand with the working class of Russia, Ukraine, and the entire world, and that's really the only viable perspective for preventing war, is the unity of the working class, in the first instance Ukrainian and Russian workers, but the United States, China, and the like. And one of the things we've emphasized is that the drive to war is bound up with definite domestic calculations. I mean, in the United States, it's now almost 1 million people who have died of COVID. You have soaring inflation, which is creating a major social crisis, or deepening a major social crisis for millions of workers. And you do have the first stirrings of very significant class struggles directed against not just company management, but the unions and the like. So these governments, I think, recognise that they're sitting on top of a social powder keg, and there's an attempt to divert those social tensions outwards through a war national unity, bring the nation together against an external foe. But one of the points we've really stressed is that the fact that there is even a risk of world war indicates just how advanced the crisis of world capitalism is. We are living through a period like the 1930s where all of the issues of war and fascism are back on the agenda, but of course that was also a period of social revolution, the intervention of the working class. So we've been, if you look at some of our perspective articles on the World Socialist website, we very much emphasise this point of following the map of the class struggle, as Leon Trotsky said, not the war map of the capitalist governments. And that's, both the means of fighting against war, but also fighting to secure the freedom of class war prisoners such as Assange.
And while I have you here, can you talk briefly, if you can you explain what was the case of the other whistleblower, Daniel Hale? A fan of the show has been wanting me to cover this topic for a long time, but I haven't. So I was wondering if you could enlighten us on what's happening with this whistleblower, what's his case, and what are the efforts to try to free him.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I couldn't say I'm as familiar with his case as Assange's or Manning's, but my understanding is that he's a US military whistleblower who exposed the character of drone warfare, that this was knowing, deliberate, indiscriminate murder of civilians and others, and for that he's being prosecuted, essentially. And we know that in the United States, you've had one whistleblower case after another. Obama actually deployed the Espionage Act against whistleblowers more than any of his predecessors, setting the stage for what Trump did, using it against a publisher. So, yeah, I mean, there's a frontal assault on opponents of militarism and war. And I think one of the critical points to raise is that that's not an indication of great strength. I don't think they'd need such a ferocious propaganda campaign, such significant censorship, if there was universal support for militarism and war. I mean, there's simply not. I mean, our party campaigns in the working class in this country, in Britain, the United States, around the world. And I think the experiences of the past 30 years of unending US wars have left a very deep imprint, as have the policies that all of these governments are pursuing. I mean, Biden is fighting for human rights and democracy in Ukraine, while he's letting tens of thousands of Americans die of a preventable infectious disease. I think people are beginning to draw.
Not giving them single payer health care or on top of that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, I think the issues of war, militarism, and the escalation of the class struggle are, deeply intertwined. And the issue of educating the working class, fighting for a socialist program within it is really the critical task for all of those who oppose what's taking place on the war front, the pandemic front, and also the assault on democratic rights.
Just before we switch topics and we talk about the ongoing coronavirus crisis, the pandemic, Daniel Hale, did he blow the whistle to which publication? Do you know?
I'd need to check on that. I believe it was The Intercept. It was not WikiLeaks.
Okay, yeah, and there's a bit of interesting, disturbing twist about the Intercept sort of burning their sources, but we're not going to get into that. People should check out Whitney Webb's journalism and press news for that. But all right, but so switching topics, while I have you here, is I want to talk about the ongoing coronavirus crisis. Now, the World Socialist website, I think you and your global colleagues like me, I think we kind of just see the coronavirus. We sort of take it at face value that this pandemic started because of animals held in terrible conditions in some open markets in China. that's how part of my language, but that's how shit hit shit hit the fan, and poof, now we have this global pandemic. Now the World Socialist website, you guys from the early get go listened to the the science, which was that to vanquish this highly infectious disease, we needed at least a 6th to 7th month lockdown in order to in order to vanquish the pandemic. Now the powers that be, they did do that, but unfortunately, they lifted the lockdowns way too early. They didn't bail out the people. They didn't give people a UBI. They didn't suspend people's rents and mortgages and stuff like that. They didn't compensate people whose businesses had to shut down. So many people did get bankrupt, and many were driven into destitution and stuff like that. But your publication still says that we should be that people should be getting vaccinated, but that we also should be going back into a 6th to 7th month lockdown in order to get rid of the pandemic forever. But we bail out the people. That's what the World Socialist website editorially supports, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the length of a lockdown, there are different estimates from epidemiologists, scientists, as to how long would be required. Definitely not 6 to 7 months. There are differences, but more in the order of 4 to 6 weeks or a couple of months maximum. I mean, this is a communicable infectious disease. If you shut down the means of it being transmitted from one person to the next, it can be eliminated quite rapidly. I think the basic point that we've stressed in terms of the official response is, in every capitalist country, you've had the subordination of public health, safety to naked business interests. That is, to keep production going at all costs, to ensure the full flow of corporate profits, and that means keeping workers on the job. That's why lockdown measures have been rejected. And I question that, really any of these governments have implemented lockdowns as epidemiologists would advocate. If you look at the United States, I mean, there was a lockdown for a couple of weeks at the very beginning of this in 2020, certain mask mandates and the like, but essentially the policy has been to allow the virus to circulate continuously since then. The same is the case in Britain. They, carried out certain lockdowns because their policies were threatening to just completely crash the healthcare system. But Boris Johnson's position was summed up when he declared, let the bodies pile high, no more lockdowns. And that's really the line of every capitalist government, whether it's a social democratic government, a conservative government, it doesn't matter. So I think what we've really emphasised is that this crisis has indicated that the most basic social rights needs of the working class, including to health and life itself, are incompatible with a society that's dominated by a tiny corporate oligarchy. And of course, as they've allowed this virus to circulate, to mutate into new variants, governments have just opened the spigots for the stock markets, poured trillions and trillions of dollars into the stock markets led by the United States. People like Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Elon Musk have made more money than anyone's made in human history in the past 2 years. Meanwhile, the working class is afflicted with mass death, growing poverty, and the like. So this is not just a medical phenomenon. I mean, principled epidemiologists are quite clear that the measures required to end the pandemic are known, they can be carried out. The obstacle is not science or medicine, but the capitalist system. And I think just quickly, the other point that we've raised about the pandemic is that we described it very early on as a trigger event, and we made the analogy to the outbreak of World War I, in that this is a development that's accelerated all of the underlying contradictions of the capitalist system that have been building up for many years. So So you've seen an intensification of militarism, which we're seeing now very sharply in Ukraine, the social onslaught on the social position of the working class, and also the attacks on democratic rights. But I think, again, the flip side of that is that this experience is having a major impact on the consciousness of the working class. It's a massive and really unprecedented social experience, which is politicizing people. And, I think certain conclusions are being drawn about the incompatibility of health, life, and private profit.
And a follow-up then I have to ask then, when we talk about the ongoing pandemic is, there are some left-leaning folk. I even have I even know people that I admire. I even have in my personal life I have friends and people who also do independent journalism and so forth who aren't for lockdowns. They're not for lockdowns, and they wouldn't describe themselves as being anti-vaxxers, but just for the sake of arguments, I am going to put them in that category that they are anti vax fundamentalism when it comes to COVID. So and of course we see all of these anti-vax protesters and anti-lockdown protesters and anti-mask protesters. You have a lot of people who are what I call COVID minimalists, that COVID is just like that COVID is just like the flu. And then you have people who are just pure denialists, like they think that COVID is a hoax. They talk about a scamdemic. And then occasionally they'll throw some bizarre conspiracy theories that this came from a bioweapons lab leak in China, even though China is an enemy of the United States officially. So that being said, so for the sake of argument, let's say that the vaccines done by Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, and Moderna aren't safe, because apparently there have been some reports that there's been very gruesome side effects, and that it's not 100% safe because the vaccine was made way too quickly. If that really is the case, then don't we really do have to go back into lockdowns? But what do you say to people who still reject even lockdowns because they say lockdowns aren't good for people's mental health, and that we really should just try the whole herd immunity approach?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think if you look at what governments and the corporate media are putting forward, they're basically claiming that the pandemic is over, it's a thing of the past, time to move on. Situation on the ground is that the virus is resurging in many regions. You have a massive outbreak now in Hong Kong, where deaths per capita are greater than they've been anywhere in the pandemic at any point in the past 2 years. So the essential position that's been adopted now is it's not even herd immunity. I mean, they're not even claiming that mass infection is somehow going to end this. Their policy is live with the virus, essentially a perpetual pandemic where, workers, ordinary people have to face the risk of infection every single day. And of course, as we know, this just transforms society into a petri dish. The more the virus is allowed to transmit, the greater the likelihood of mutations, of new variants, which could be both, more infectious, more virulent, and vaccine resistant, as Omicron and Omicron BA2, the new variant, appear to be. I think in terms of the issue of the vaccines, the consensus is very clear among scientists. I mean, these vaccines do prevent the incidence of, or lower the incidence of severe illness and death. They are a significant advance made possible by the collaboration of scientists around the world. Of course, that takes place within the framework of the capitalist system. So Pfizer and others are making substantial profits. All of this is patented. So, the poorer third world countries are being denied access to vaccines still. So I think, our position is that vaccines are a critical weapon in the arsenal of public health, but they're just one aspect of it. What's been presented by governments, the ruling elite, is that vaccine alone will resolve this, will end the pandemic, which has been proven not to be the case. What's required are public health measures. There's a question of lockdowns, but I mean, even, universal masking with N95 masks, high quality masks, the issues of air filtration, because we know this disease spreads primarily through indoor transmission. I mean, I'd encourage your viewers to check out on the World Socialist website a workers' inquest into the global pandemic, which our movement is carrying out. It includes many interviews with scientists, epidemiologists, explaining the measures that could be taken, condemning the official response, and also critically statements from workers about their experiences during the pandemic. I think just quickly, in terms of what you referenced, the anti-vax movement, I think, there is a layer of libertarian sort of independent journalists who, view any public health measure as an unpardonable infringement on personal liberty. You could say the same about seatbelts, about drink driving laws. I mean, people don't have the right to deliberately or knowingly threaten other people with a, potentially deadly disease. That's not a right. There is a necessity for a society-wide response to the pandemic. And if you look at it, I mean, many of their positions dovetail with those of the governments, the corporate elite. Lockdowns are finished. Got to move on, got to keep the schools open. That's been encouraged, that's been stoked by the corporate media and by governments. And these forces, the sort of anti-vax forces, what we saw in Canada, to a certain extent, function as the sort of shock troops of this campaign. And I think just the last point, I mean, it's very distorted. If you look in most countries, there's very little polling done, but when there is, the overwhelming response is that we need to do more to end the pandemic. We need to protect health. I mean, that's the basic sentiment within the working class that hasn't found expression in mass protests, mass strikes, because it's suppressed by the trade unions, the Labor parties like here. And that creates a situation where these right-wingers play a vastly outsized role in comparison to their numbers. I mean, even if you look at this Canadian truckers thing, I mean, 90% of Canadian truckers are vaccinated and were opposed to this. International media campaign, and they could only really mobilise a few thousand people. But these forces are emboldened because what they're putting forward is very much in line with the official policies,
Yeah. But what would you say? And two quick follow-ups then is what's your response then to nurses and doctors who say they don't want to get vaccinated because they don't trust the safety of the the safety of the vaccine. Because I know that the World Socialist website has also talked with many nurses who encourage people to get who encourage people to get vaccinated, but them and teachers are advocating, please, we need to go to lockdowns and we need the people's bailouts. But what do you say to what's your response to some of those hospital staffers and people who work in social care who don't want to get vaccinated because they don't trust the safety of the vaccine?
I think, there is a degree of confusion, and that's because many people recognise that, governments everywhere represent big business. They lie very frequently. There's a great deal of confusion on public health because, so much about the pandemic has been falsified in support of this live with the virus agenda. Even the fact that, COVID is an airborne disease was denied by the WHO for an extended period, by governments, etc. So I think all of that creates an atmosphere where right-wing demagogues, anti-vaxxers can win a certain hearing. But if you look at it, I mean, there are countries that have imposed vaccine mandates for health workers, including most states here. The vast majority of health workers get vaccinated because they want to protect their patients. I saw a post a little while back from a nurse in Victoria, an Australian state, and she went through what becoming a nurse means in terms of vaccinations. They get vaccinated for everything, you know, all the strains of hepatitis, you know, many different communicable diseases, because they're working with vulnerable patients and they have a responsibility not to pass on viruses, diseases. So that would be our position. I mean, we do support mandatory universal vaccination as one element in the necessary public health response to end the pandemic and save lives.
And to those on the left, or those who claim to be on the left who support the Barrington Declaration, can you explain to people how the Barrington Declaration is a reactionary, market fundamentalist, libertarian, junk science approach to overcoming the pandemic?
Yeah, well, I mean, what it outlined is essentially what's now being implemented by governments around the world. Allow this virus to spread because the measures required to end transmission would have too great an impact on business activity. They mentioned protecting the vulnerable. They never really say how that's going to be done. And in practice, you know, what is the policy? It's cull the elderly, let the disabled die, and the like. We see that every day. I mean, the fact that you have thousands and thousands of people dying around the world is not really mentioned. In the United States, I think the death figures have gone down somewhat in the last couple of weeks, but it's still over 1,000 people dying a day. I mean, you've got a couple of September 11s taking place every week, and it's not mentioned anywhere. So the essential thrust of the Great Barrington Declaration was that, the herd immunity policy. The authors met with the Trump administration, with Trump himself, who was very favourably inclined to their policies, and the promotion of them, including by Jacobin magazine, the DSA publication, is very significant. Again, it's the alignment of this sort of affluent upper middle class layer.
Wait, hold on for a second. Jacobin endorsed the Barrington Declaration, or?
They published an interview, a favourable interview with one of the authors of that declaration, in which he, denounced lockdowns and trotted out many of the sort of familiar talking points that lockdowns are bad because of the impact that they have on working class conditions. Obviously that accepts the whole framework of capitalism. I mean, we say where lockdowns, business closures are carried out, there should be full compensation for affected workers. And in that interview, the Great Barrington person, again, put forward the issues of mental health and the like. Many of these talking points, cynically deployed by forces who are putting forward a program that will result in mass death, mass illness. I mean, what's the mental health consequence of a child losing a parent or both parents to COVID? Immense.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then one last question then about COVID is, is how do you assess the Australian government, both on the federal level and both on the federal level and on the different premier levels of your neck of the wood, New South Wales, Sydney. How do you assess the Australian response? Because I often hear from people that Australia's response to coronavirus has been a very good response. So, respond to that, please.
Yeah, well, I think in the earliest phases of the pandemic, position put forward by the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, was We need to live with this. In the first weeks, he was encouraging people to go to the football and everything else. What took place is, I mean, there was substantial opposition to that from the working class, particularly key sections like teachers, health workers, doctors, nurses, as well as principal epidemiologists. And governments here were compelled to adopt certain public health measures. They rejected a strategy of elimination because they said that would cost too much. But they did carry out very limited lockdowns during outbreaks. And for all of the business exemptions, the loopholes, the fact that these weren't thorough measures, they did succeed in eliminating transmission for extended periods of time. So in the first year of the pandemic, there was a little over 30,000 cases in all of Australia, a country of 25 million people. I mean, these measures were successful, but as has happened in a number of countries that have adopted public health measures, they've been dispensed with very sharply. That began with Delta waves mid last year, and then it really accelerated with the advent of Omicron. They allowed Omicron to enter the country, and then they finished lifting restrictions right as it began surging. So there have now been more deaths this year, over 3,000, than in each of the previous 2 years of the pandemic.
Wow.
Millions of infections. No one really knows how many infections because the testing system was allowed to collapse in December, January. And now, once again, cases are rising, it appears, as a result of this BA2 variant. And just in terms of, the question of Morrison versus the various state premiers, it's very significant. I mean, all of the Labor premiers are on board with this program, and they've really played the critical role in pressing ahead.
And that program has been what?
Pardon?
The
program. Yeah, the reopening and lifting all restrictions, live with the virus. So in Victoria, for instance, the Premier is a Labor Party representative, Daniel Andrews. He was, to a certain extent, associated with public health measures. So the right-wing media called him Dictator Dan because of lockdowns and the like. But mid to late last year, he shifted. He said, it's not realistic to try to eliminate this. We've got to live with it, open everything up. And all of the COVID policies here have been discussed and decided upon by a national cabinet, which is composed of the federal government, federal Conservative government, and then the state and territory premiers, most of whom are Labor Party. So they've not just gone along with this, live with the virus drive, they've, drawn it up, implemented it, and the like.
Unbelievable. So basically that smashes the myth that Australia has been somewhat has been good in their response to coronavirus. And basically, if Australia has been good at responding to coronavirus, it's only because of nurses and teachers lobbying for them to at least do some kind of measure against COVID, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the experiences here did show that public health measures work. I mean, it is possible to eliminate the virus, to end transmission, and on that basis, to live a fairly normal life. I mean, the biggest example of this is obviously China, the most populous country in the world. They've maintained a zero COVID policy, and in the bulk of the country for most of the past 2 years, there haven't been lockdowns because they haven't had the virus. They've deployed public health measures when outbreaks have been identified with the aim of ending them as rapidly as possible. They're doing the same now with a rising number of BA2 cases in certain cities. But I think, particularly the experiences in Australia but elsewhere demonstrate that the period when capitalist governments would carry out certain limited public health measures is over. New Zealand has also abandoned its elimination policy. They have a very large Omicron surge. So the issue of the fight against the virus is now very much dependent on and bound up with an independent movement of the working class against all of these governments and the official parties.
And that's a very good segue to endless to the fact that Australia has been Australia was always very much a liberal democracy, mainly a liberal democracy, and it became very much an ultra liberal plutocracy under Bob Hawke and Paul Keating. And so I want to ask, when you talk about all of these grotesque oligarchic governments, whether it's Labor or the Liberal Party, over in Canada, it's the Conservatives, it's the Liberal Party, the pseudo-left NDP in the US, Democrats, Republicans. But specifically when we talk about Australia, how much can you blame the legacy of Bob Hawke and Paul Keating on the current coronavirus crisis?
Well, I think, as you indicated, Hawke and Keating, Labor prime ministers backed by the trade unions, carried out in Australia the policies associated with Margaret Thatcher in Britain and Ronald Reagan in the United States, that is economic deregulation, floating of the dollar, and really the destruction of whole sections of industry considered insufficiently profitable. And they did set in place a whole architecture which remains very draconian: industrial laws banning strikes, union enterprise agreement through which the trade union bureaucracy is pushed through one agreement or contract after another, cutting wages, conditions. So all of that, has created a social crisis which persists and is deepening now under the pandemic. And of course, successive governments, again, tracing back to Hawke and Keating, have carried out a huge onslaught on public health care, public education, and the like, all of which are major factors in this pandemic crisis and the way it's being responded to. So, yeah.
And when we talk, your fellow countryman John Pilger recently did a documentary on the assault on the NHS by successive governments, and how New Labour set the motion of privatizing the NHS, and the nail in the coffin was the Tory Liberal coalition government of David Cameron and Nick Clegg. Now, in Australia, do you still have a single-payer healthcare system, or has that also been effectively privatized? Who was the one? And if the answer is yes, it has been privatized, who was the one that did the privatizing, of it?
There is still a public healthcare system. There's Medicare. So on paper, there's universal public healthcare. What you've had is just a gutting and running down of public hospitals, in particular by successive governments at the state and federal levels. I think coming into the pandemic, the ratio of hospital beds to the population was among the lowest in Australia of the OECD countries, which just gives you a sense, fewer even than Italy and some of these Southern European countries. And of course, the assault on public healthcare has served to push people into the private system, so that they can get better care. That's been a major development of the past 2 decades. But the situation in the hospitals through much of the pandemic has and continues to be just catastrophic. Nurses working 2 shifts back to back, really no semblance of nurse to patient ratios, such that critically ill patients are not receiving sufficient care. And again, like many things, this wasn't caused by the pandemic. I mean, many of these problems, understaffing and the like, existed for years and years, and they've just been exacerbated that much more by this global health crisis. And again, it's the issues of Labor and Liberal governments, but above all, the trade unions who have suppressed any struggle by health workers against this, and enforced the dictates of management, government, and the like. There was a one-day strike by nurses in New South Wales a month ago. It was significant that proceeded in defiance of a ban by the industrial courts. The union sought to isolate it, divide it up, but the fact that it did go ahead and that nurses took this stand, I think, is a sign of growing opposition, growing anger, and a mood of a real, that there needs to be a fight back. So that's something we're orienting to, fighting to develop, and insisting on the need for nurses and really every other section of the working class to begin forming rank and file committees independent of the unions that can link up these various struggles nationally, internationally, and really wage a genuine political industrial fight. And of course, raising centrally the issue of a socialist program. Because again, the issues of public health, public education, it's the issue of, or the question of how society is organised, in whose interests, and for what purpose.
And what's the state of education in Australia? In Australia, is the cost of education, whether it's early childhood all the way up until university, is that mostly, depending on which state you're living in, it's subsidized and it's run on the cheap for the working class, or is it all mostly, you know, overpriced, in private hands? And when you go into university, you basically, kind of like in Britain and the United States, you have to take, these loans to pay for these astronomical prices, whether it's a public university or a private one. Like, is that how the system is in Australia, or?
Yeah, I guess there are different aspects to it. I mean, certainly childcare, so for infant children beneath the age of 5 is extremely expensive. It's a massive cost for many working class families who have to pay hundreds and hundreds of dollars every week so that their children are looked after. In terms of schooling, similar to health, I mean, the public school system has just been run down extraordinarily over the past couple of decades. Obviously, teaching used to be a profession where you had, or thought you had certain conditions, a certain salary. It was viewed as a decent profession, I guess. That's completely changed. You have a massive workload crisis where teachers are being compelled to work hours and hours unpaid each week to prepare lessons and the like. In New South Wales, so where I am, there's a major teaching shortage in the public schools, such that at many working class schools you have lessons that are not being covered because they don't have anyone to teach them. That's because the conditions are so bad, the workload's so high that a lot of graduates either aren't going into the sector or they're not staying. So all of that has also resulted in a substantial growth of the private school system, which accounts for, I think it's more than 40% of all student enrolments in most states. So even working class families are being compelled to send their kids to private and independent schools to try to get a decent education. In terms of universities, so it's not free. It used to be that, again, fees were reintroduced by Hawke and Keating. You get a state subsidised loan, it's called HECS, but as is the case in many other countries, people leave school with or leave university with a substantial debt on the books, which they need to begin repaying once they start earning a certain amount each year. So very similar to the global processes I think you're discussing. It's the same everywhere.
Unbelievable. That's it's it's just unbelievable. And I think my final two questions. Number one, we keep talking. We talk about this ongoing trend, and we talk about how much of the left is as you guys would call them, the pseudo left, are complicit in this. And so my second to last question that I have to ask you is what is it going to take for the working class to stop supporting their misleaders in the in the union leadership, and stop supporting all of these rival oligarchic parties, and even pseudo left parties who go along with the institutional classism and the endless austerity, as well as the endless warmongering.
Well, I think it's important to recognise that there has been a huge political shift over the course of a number of decades. I mean, in this country, Labor was regarded as the party of the working class. In the working class suburbs, you had large Labor Party branches, which were a focal point of political life, but social life. This was a party that did have a relationship to the working class, even as it was always a capitalist party. It defended the profit system. Yeah. All of that has changed. I mean, none of these parties have any mass base of support. Labor lost the last election in 2019, unlosable election, because it didn't win enough votes in working class suburbs. Its vote collapsed in the working class areas of the country. And I think if you look at the trade unions, their membership has also plummeted, particularly in the private sector. It's beneath 10%. For many younger workers, the unions just are not an aspect of their lives. And I think that's, of course, a product of the right-wing pro-business policies that these organisations have implemented in line with their class character. So I think, long story short, there is growing political opposition, a developing radicalisation around the issues of COVID, the social crisis, the growth of inequality, and we anticipate that there will be major working class struggles emerging over the coming period. But the key issue is the development of a leadership, a party based on a socialist and internationalist perspective, which is what the Socialist Equality Party in Australia is. And so obviously we're fighting to build our party within the working class, among students, young people. And, we encourage everyone to read our material and to apply to join.
Perfect. And then just before we end, I'll have to have you on in the future to talk about to talk about the legacy of Rudd, Gillard, Turnbull, and Scott Morrison. But I'm not going to bother you with that today. But I definitely would like to have you back on to discuss that. This will be my second to last question. Is what is the current state of Aboriginal affairs? Has the intervention finally been lifted? And what's the current state of the Aboriginal Black Lives Matter going on? And is the SCP calling for defunding / abolishing the police, or what's the SCP's position when it comes to that and addressing the grievances of Aboriginal Australians?
Yeah, well, I mean, none of the issues confronting the Aboriginal population have been resolved in the slightest. The situation's getting worse on every metric, life expectancy, health. Actually, COVID has rampaged through a number of remote Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory, in the country's north. The overwhelming majority of COVID deaths and serious illnesses have been among Indigenous people. So again, the sort of let it rip policies hitting the most vulnerable the hardest. We also wrote an article on the World Socialist website the other day about a police officer being acquitted of both murder and manslaughter. He shot to death a 19-year-old Aboriginal man or boy in a remote Northern Territory town 2 years ago. I mean, there's more than 500 deaths in custody over the past 30 years, and not a single cop has been prosecuted. So in terms of the intervention, I mean, I would say it continues in different forms. I mean, these communities are still policed by these heavily militarized forces, many of them with an army background. And of course, you know, there is racism, discrimination. The police are, you know, it's a fascistic force. But one of the things that we really stress is that the Aboriginal population is the most exploited and oppressed section of the Australian working class, and very frequently attacks that are first carried out on Aboriginals are then broadened to the working class as a whole. One of the central aspects of, you know, the Northern Territory intervention was welfare quarantining. So, you know, taking over people's welfare and giving them a basic card to get certain necessities. That has subsequently been trialled in certain working class suburbs of Sydney in particular.
Wow.
So that's one of the central issues we raise. I mean, the oppression of Aboriginals is a class issue. It's not going to be resolved on the basis of Aboriginal nationalist politics, land rights, whatever else, which are only going to benefit a small layer of, you know, privileged Aboriginal bureaucrats. So our perspective is very much to fight for the unity of the working class, Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal, etc. And of course, in terms of the, excuse me, in terms of the police, I mean, the police are an instrument of the capitalist state. Their function is to oppress, repress the working class, including its most exploited elements. And so we fight for the replacement of the capitalist state by a workers' state, which would nationalise the banks, the major corporations, and obviously would not have a repressive police force that functioned in the interests of big business. Yeah.
Well, would you be for something called community control over the police? Do you think that would help Aboriginal communities and the state terror that they face, and bring greater accountability to the classist slash racist thugs that commit their crimes against humanity against Aboriginal people?
No, I don't think so. I mean, this, you know,
Okay.
issue of community control over police and the like, the issue is the fundamental class role of the police, of the state, in enforcing the dictates of big business, the banks, and suppressing the working class. And that's going to persist, whatever the racial composition of the police, whoever is providing them with advice. You know, quite frankly, such exercises in community control are often amount to putting lipstick on a pig, to be blunt, giving a sense that ordinary people have some control over the police, over the capitalist state, when of course they don't. And I think if you look at the experience in the United States, I mean, so many of these cities where youth, you know, black and white, are being shot by the police are run by Black Democratic Party mayors, governors, even police chiefs. I mean, it doesn't matter what their, you know, racial background is, their ethnicity. If they're part of the police or aligned with the police, they're on the side of the capitalist state.
Alrighty, and okay, interesting. And but you would be for but would you and the SCP then be for advocating abolishing the police, or yeah? I mean, would you guys be in favor of some kind of defunding the police as a way to abolish the police, or short term wise, reforms like ending the drug war, ending, people being put in prison for unpaid parking fines and other, sort of very Dickensian punitive things that mostly affect Aboriginal people, but also white working class Aussies.
Yeah, of course. I mean, we're for the militarized police to be out of these communities. We demanded an end to the intervention. We denounced it as discriminatory, racist, and an attack on the working class. I mean, clearly, this needs to end, and socialists need to fight for that. I think that the question is how. And the police are not going to abolish themselves. The Labor Party is not going to abolish the police. They're an integral component of the capitalist state. And one aspect of, or central aspect of the growth of police violence, the surging prison population, is just the huge social inequality that exists. As we've discussed in relation to Assange, you can't have democracy when society is run by a tiny corporate oligarchy. So I think the issues of ending police violence, ending police brutality, ending the capitalist police is bound up with the fight for socialism, for the reorganization of society, and for a society that's controlled and run by workers themselves.
Alrighty. And alrighty. I think you've been very generous with with your time. And then just before we end, I always end the show now with this questionnaire done by Marcel Proust, later Bernard Pivot, and the late James Lipton of Inside the Actor Studio. So Oscar, so just before I let you enjoy the rest of your weekend, here it goes. Oscar, what is your favorite words?
Multiple words.
You can do multiple words.
Oh, you've put me on the spot. I'll say socialist.
What's your least favorite words?
Oh, I think I might have to pass on that one. Yeah.
Capitalist?
Sure, we'll go with that.
What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
Oh, I think examining the issues of history in particular is extremely engaging. It's very central to the work of our party, and it's the indispensable basis for understanding the present. So I certainly enjoy reading about that, and also literature, fiction, and film.
What turns you off then?
Deadlines and difficult tasks. Not sure.
And what's your favorite curse words?
I'm very well spoken. I don't think I'd engage in that.
No F-bombs here and there, or?
Oh, everyone does occasionally.
What sound or noise do you love?
Pardon?
What sound or noise do you love?
Oh, I'm not sure. The sound of rain at night.
Okay. What sound or noise do you hate?
Loud construction.
And what profession other than yours would you like to attempt to do?
I'm not sure. I think, studying issues of history, literature is something that interests me, but I'm very happy doing what I'm doing.
And what profession would you not like to do under any circumstances?
Well, we were just discussing the police, so I can go with that.
All right. And the final one, if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
I'm convinced it doesn't exist, so I'll have to pass on that one as well.
Well, if he does, I'm sure he would say, see, I do exist. All righty. Well, we are joined on this edition of 1+1 with Oscar Grenfell Socialist Equality Party of Australia, and he's a frequent contributor to the World Socialist website. I will make sure to post a link so that people can follow all of your journalism, as well as the website of the Socialist Equality Party of Australia, and the YouTube page, so that people if they are based in Australia, they can they can join that. Oscar, thank you so much for coming at very much the last minute to discuss this very important case with Julian Assange. I wish you and your colleagues the best of luck in your campaign to free this man who should be getting every single Peace Prize imaginable. And give my best to Nick, give my best to Thomas Peters, John Braddock, give my best to Chris Marsden. And once again, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thanks very much for having me on, and it's been a pleasure.
Yes, and I look forward to having you back on again in the future.
Okay, thanks a lot.
All right, ciao.
See you later. Bye-bye.